Okay, it feels a bit like sort of someone calling for fresh horses. But I wanted to provide an opportunity. We have two students here from the second year, Eleanor and Jack, who have sort of sat through a modified course this year, and we have three young teachers who will introduce themselves, who are teaching, I mean, not only at the AA, but also around, but they all did the MA Histories and Theories and are also now kind of involved in some teaching in the school. So perhaps everyone could start off by saying who they are and what bit of the school they're involved with. And really, I want just first of all to ask them round the table, since asking the audience is rather dangerous, if they'd like to kind of respond to some of the materials that have come up at the conference, but putting it back into the context of the courses they've taken and how they would like to teach. Say, Mollie, if you start here.
So I'm Mollie. Is that? I'm Mollie, and I teach here at the AA in the DRL in the sort of architectural research and writing course that they have, and in third year HTS, and also at the University of Reading, and taught a little bit at the University of Brighton. And I'm currently a project editor at Braden Press.
Hello, I'm Dillon. I teach with Mollie in DRL in the synthesis writing course. I also teach first year history and theory with Maria, and I'm working for EGG office, which is a design firm in Los Angeles. So that's my history. Jack?
I'm Jack Self. I'm a second year student here. I've, as Mark said, taken his course. I enjoy needlework and long walks along the beach.
I hate the beach. I'm from North Dakota in the United States, which couldn't be any further from the beach. So we may clash on that point. I'm Braden Engel. I'd finished the MA Histories and Theories degree 2 years ago. I'm now a tutor in that program and a Histories and Theories tutor at the University of Greenwich.
Like Jack, I'm in second year. My name's Eleanor, and I don't have any comments on needlework or beaches either.
Okay, so if I ask each of you to somehow respond both to maybe some issues that came up over the 2 days, but put it back into your own experience.
Well, I think actually one of the points that sort of stimulated a lot of thought for me was the notion of the discussion yesterday with the archive with Tom Weaver when he stated that it wasn't, the archive for him wasn't necessarily there to discover or privilege the retrieval of artifacts. For me, in my own work, at least in the MA, and now sort of my attitude towards teaching, particularly in third year HTS, is that I approach history not necessarily through what already is known or what exists, insofar as I'm interested in sort of the disappearance of ideas and sort of the potential for research in the disappearance of either pedagogy or objects themselves in architectural history. So I find sort of the potential of the archive, for instance, in sort of giving students the opportunity to find gaps or search for truths that necessarily were forgotten. So that's sort of my approach to teaching right now. This past year in third year, we, as one of the students earlier said, approached 16 iconic buildings. And for me, I constantly sort of, instead of approaching it through a survey course where we sort of addressed these buildings in a very straightforward way, I oftentimes tried to pit them against each other and so you would have like a X versus Y discussion and talk about the difference rather than sort of what they represent pedagogically, which I think is a little bit easier for students to sort of sit there and not necessarily engage. So for me, that's sort of how I've engaged as for my first year teaching.
Okay.
And so on and so forth.
Questions first or me? Okay. I think for me, coming from I think a few of the lectures we heard this past couple days, is sort of how the students, whether it's in design class or in history and theory, use history or use the past to sort of inform their design and their architecture and how they're working within studio, which seems to be a disconnect here at the school between that link between studio and history and theory teaching. I mean, for me, it's not so much about teaching a catalog of history that the student can sort of always go back to, but it's more about teaching the history, what they're doing in studio or what they're learning in more contemporary architecture, how they can actually utilize the past to inform or better support their architectural endeavors. Sort of, I think what Jeff was saying in the sense that you can begin to utilize and manipulate the past to begin to inform your own theories on architecture. For me, again, it's not about this catalog, this survey. It's more about allowing the student to have a palette to always be able to inform what they're doing in studio and design, and be able to manipulate that history as best as they can see forward, and to show them that there is a link between what they're doing now and the past.
I want to respond to the kind of last interaction, and particularly what Mark was saying about the relationship or the debate as to whether or not it should be architectural pasts or histories. And what I have to say is perhaps not very easy for me to say, but I'm quite struck. I read recently Rancière says that art is a political act. Art is always a political act. And he means this in the kind of Lacanian notion of kind of disdain. And I think, therefore, if history and theory is more concerned with what we might call architecture as art rather than architecture as a technological expression, it's because it recognizes that architecture as art is the politics of space, not simply a technological expression. And I think the mistake made by quite a lot of unit masters, which is where I'm going to let the blame fall, is a separation of art as a formal activity from art as a political statement. If we come back to history and theory, I think history and theory is really kind of a microcosm for a challenge that architecture as a profession is facing at the moment. The decline in interest in history and theory has got very little to do with the historians or the theoreticians, I feel. It has to do with the fact that it's not valued by unit masters, and therefore it's not seen as relevant to the students who are partaking in those studios. I think history and theory should focus on convincing studio masters that that it is relevant in their activity, if it wishes to avoid becoming seen as obsolete. I also think that the architect as a figure in society, if they wish to avoid obsolescence or perceived obsolescence, is to reinstill the ability to convince society of their political role.
I think that's quite interesting what both of you just said, actually, because firstly, I think it's up to the student whether or not they sort of combine the history and theory with their unit. I mean, when it comes to sort of writing the essays, I mean, we were pretty much given a free sort of, we could choose what we based it on, and I mean, it's your choice whether you base it on what your unit agenda is or something that you're interested in your unit. And I think that they can sort of, that you can combine them, and it's not necessarily the fault of the unit master. Or maybe that's just the case of my unit.
But if you're in an apolitical unit, a unit that, say, for example, is driven by some sort of technological investigation rather than any type of social or political question, then it leaves you in rather a weak position to choose something that is of interest. I mean, it's difficult to respond if you haven't been provoked in some way.
Yeah, that's true. But
I mean,
well, well, my unit did provoke me to write my essay about my unit and then bring back what Mark was saying into what I was doing in my unit.
Yeah, but
I used both in order to further investigate what I was trying to do.
I think it should be said that your unit is based on Foucault's essay about
other spaces,
heterotopias. So it's by its nature quite a kind of political agenda. But I'm specifically referring, and I don't want to name names or point fingers, but what about units which are apolitical by their nature, which don't intend to investigate any type of political questions?
But you just said that architecture is the politics of space, so
Yeah.
surely there is some sort of politics in the creation of space. Like, you must be interested in something, and therefore there must be a way of relating it back to whatever's been said in your history and theory. I mean, we, with Mark, talked about such a wide variety of things. There wasn't, particularly in the second term. I mean...
Touché.
See there? Wasn't that hard? Now, I know there's no human being that lives in North Dakota, so I know you're a bullshitter already.
it is just a mask. I mean, any time, I don't think we'll get anywhere by ever saying architecture is this, architecture is that. It's not going to lead to any kind of productive discussion, especially when we're talking about the past of architecture, architectural history. The question is, how do you kind of invent that history for yourself, or form or create that past for yourself in the education, in the academic setting of learning to try to become what we call as an architect, which is still nobody really knows. I mean, surely it's part of the unit system at the AA that each unit has its own agenda. That's part of the nature of the system. And so how they decide or how they choose to use what they call history of the past is going to be depending on whichever unit you're in. I think it's difficult to blame them. The question to me is still engaging. I mean, how is it that history or the past of architecture is actually kind of tackled between the student and the tutor, as opposed to something like a teacher is someone who kind of possesses the knowledge of architectural history and imparts it or impresses it upon the student or the subject. I mean, to me, it's surely something that is invented in the middle ground between the two.
Well, this is what I was saying, right? Is that if we present, say something that doesn't exist at the AA is a straight survey course of sort of architectural history, right? Which is something that I know you, Mark, have sort of said, like, have not wanted to do for various reasons. But say if you have that survey course, you have that sort of baseline sort of like, okay, so first we had like the Neolithic pit structures, and then we sort of like move on. That gives students the opportunity to sort of challenge where, I guess, either gaps in history occur or be able to pit sort of different styles or different concepts against each other, right? So it's kind of a combination between both of you, really. It's not, the unit master's fault for not providing that sort of like baseline, and it's not the student's responsibility entirely either, but it's more so the ability to sort of do what you're saying of being able to have that ability to interpret.
But then maybe the units and history and theory should be more combined. Like, for example, maybe the unit masters should come to one of the history and theory classes and like speak for 10 minutes about what their unit agenda is, and then
I think one thing actually that...
You reckon they'd be up for that?
No, but if they were forced to do it.
Well, I mean, we could say either way. Either like the students are forced to attend, that would be step one, or the unit masters are forced to engage. Yeah. But say I had an experience recently where a unit master asked me, hey, do you cover Super Studio in your third year lectures? Because we really need that knowledge in our unit. And I said, no, we don't specifically cover Super Studio this year, but we engage with sort of people that are working around at the same time, therefore there are ideas that are applicable to your unit. He said, well, why not Super Studio? And I had to sort of explain that, right?
This is something we're, I think, sort of trying to develop in our first year class, where we will sort of highlight in the lectures a specific architectural term, form, space, program, event, atmosphere, whatever it may be, and have the lecture geared towards that element of architecture. And then the hope is sort of that within the first year design course, that it could be somewhat structured to when they're talking about those elements within the design course, that they're also getting the history and theory sort of based within the history course. So it's something, I think it's sort of, the framework is there within first year, but it hasn't been developed because there isn't that connection between the unit teachers and the history and theory teacher. So, which is, that detachment is a problem.
Well, I think one thing is if we studied, in a sense, architecture's pasts rather than, a syllabus of architectural history, you ought to see, at the best, different schools emerging, as it were, with different architectural pasts. You could almost kind of start it as a kind of parlor game, like who in architectural history would fit in with the AA? Maybe Wren, absolutely not, but Hawksmoor, yes. And then you could sort of develop that idea as to what would be a sort of system of identifications in the past, which would yield you something consistent with its present identity. Or you could almost do it between units. What sort of past would be appropriate, as it were? And of course it would completely vary from unit to unit. It's where the past is not just what's been, but is a way of articulating the problem that it's working through.
There would be a series of individual studio anthologies that would develop, that would talk to each other.
But I believe the history of architectural institutions is a history like that even today.
Yes.
There used to be much clearer cut distinctions among schools with identities. Temporarily, I think instrumentation has narrowed that, but I still think they're very different. I still cite SciArt, Columbia, AA, Ohio State, Angoponta have very distinct identities, very distinct approaches to both design, technology, technique, and history. So it sounds to me if that's one of the measures of at least a presence of the past and a consideration of the history, that you would see character emerge, that you actually see that. It was a question, this is commenting on Mark. How do you know what's missing from an archive? I love your idea and I know a story for you, but this idea that you go in the archive, you look around, and what's missing is what's interesting to you, I thought that was pretty good.
I think something that is actually something that I realized recently was there was a project in one of the graduate programs here that was published online, and there was a very specific historical precedent for that project that it didn't seem that that project had learned from that much. And so I think something that's really useful about the AA archive is that there are a catalog of unit projects there that students can refer to, maybe not specifically from their unit itself, but from other units that they can constantly refer to, and therefore can take and critique them and use that critique to inform the way that they design their own work, which is, for me, how I see the gaps, right? If you're doing research, you go to an archive with a very specific sort of purpose, and that purpose fits into a framework where you can sort of apply what you can get out of the archive to your own work. But I don't see the sort of I'm not going to sit there and say, well, we're missing, a Corinthian column from like 1865 and blah blah blah. Just not like that actually exists. But you know what I mean. I'm not going to sit there and design and try to figure out what that is. But I'm saying it can inform sort of the design process. Therefore, history doesn't become sort of a linear thing. It becomes a ever-changing sort of like organism or body.
I think perhaps I should say that before I came to the AA, I also studied 3 years of architecture in Australia, and in some ways it was a reasonably conventional architectural history and theory course with some notable exceptions. But it began, with Vitruvius and worked through in a very linear manner. And so for me to then arrive in a second-year history and theory course here, where there's this constant questioning of what is the kind of validity of this particular story that we tell, it's very, very interesting for me because I'm able to compare it to what I already know as a kind of accepted myth. But I think perhaps the challenge is that you might try to be trying to teach two things simultaneously. This is what everyone says, believe it. Oh, but wait, it's not real, don't believe it. And so you can't sort of be constantly subversive unless you already have an accepted notion of what it is.
I mean, I think something
and
that
perhaps, perhaps when you talk about noticing what's missing from an archive, I mean, when you have a very constructed notion of what should be in the archive, well, this period influenced another period, and then you begin to find incongruencies in that. Perhaps that's where the opportunity for archives to influence your thinking comes about.
I mean, I think something that I've at least put a concerted effort into doing in seminars for both the DRL and for HTS is presenting my knowledge of whatever history we're reading, whether it's contemporary architectural theory or sort of more historical or modernism, is that it's my sort of opinion and my interpretation, which is something that I don't think is so explicit in the other parts of the school, whether it's design unit or whatever, right? Is that I think that there needs to be more of a sort of, well, I'm here and I'm actually still learning, and this is my opinion, and you can feel free to sort of contest that. And oftentimes, students, I think, either want to hear an absolute or are not able to or can't formulate a way to sort of, get into a contention with me.
Apathy encourages absolutes, though. It's you just memorize it and regurgitate it.
Yeah, but I'm not saying, I'm saying that even a base, someone that's studying in, say, the pop studio should know who Venturi is, right?
Mm.
So there's a sort of a baseline that I think needs to happen at some point. And maybe that's just because I'm from the US and I had 3 years of sort of, architectural history 1, architectural history 2, modernism, in my education at least.
Less than a half hour.
It's going to be I accept that you usually would unravel a past through a kind of contemporary position and gather a kind of sequence towards you and beyond. I mean, and that's one thing we do. Like with the DRL, we construct our own little histories of precedents and the history of computation in architecture and pick out a sequence of critical projects which seem to have ambitions similar to us to expand the repertoire and maybe have some test of efficacy. But I think there's a different approaches, contemporary approach, and construct the kind of canons but I think there should be a more ambitious aspect. I mean, what I've just described is simply you have settled in on a position and you just want to kind of enhance this, validate that, garner further inspiration for it and so on. And that's why we go back to Frauto and look at, it kind of feeds directly into what we're doing. But I think there's a more ambitious notion and necessity. Let's assume you want to critically defend and proselytize about the position you've formulated. And you want to critically think through whether it's tenability. Then you have to try to write a comprehensive history of all architecture and all building, in fact. Although it's an important insight that architecture starts as a kind of a self-referential category, and that adds a new level of consciousness and self-reflection and history writing, but it doesn't mean that your hint at analyzing how cave dwellings or nomadic tents as a substrate of societal formation is also part and parcel. But where I want to come to is there's this more ambitious aspect of history where history doesn't become a kind of instruction or canon inspiration, but where a kind of test bed of analyzing, for instance, questioning in Marx terms, what are the key categories which we take for granted. I'm in a Havening approach, I'm using a set of key categories. What is its legitimacy, validity, and
potential future viability of this, I have to understand the formation of these categories, where they came in, why they flourished, also certain repertoires which came at the same time, how they fitted in with certain social problematics, certain constitutional audience, and see whether and then how these categories evolved, because their point of origin is not their current efficacy and role and their future potential. So and that becomes a very ambitious project, and some of what Marx was doing hints at that, and that's a kind of collective deep history which must be as comprehensive as possible to locate, and there becomes test cases also. You look at previous attempts of constructing a collective movement, a new style, etc., as why did this fail? Why the Superstudio can be inspired by Superstudio and even not only take up its techniques, also its kind of ambitions and what architecture could mean in society, but I also have to recognize the kind of disappearance and failure and non-proliferation of this, or the temporary flourishing of this, and then demise of this. So that's why I'm saying there is this kind of history as just a collection of things to be utilized. Then there's a history as a kind of description and narrative of causal chains and influences and cross-influences. But for me, the fundamental category is history in the functionalist mode, a functional explanation of categories, of phenomena, and I look at history not when this first occurs and who was influencing who, but at what point, under what wider conditions did something flourish to the extent that it kind of wrapped around the globe and so on. So that I'm doing ultimately when I understand the rationality, the functional efficacy and performance of certain ideas when they disseminate, certain stylistic moves when they catch on and deliver a next level of civilizatory evolution. This kind of notion is a very ambitious notion, and I want to just offer that as the kind of history you have to write and think through if you want to lead this discipline. So there's a kind of high-level notion of historiography which you acquire when you want to give leadership to the discipline.
Right. But what?
I actually do want to ask you a question. Seeing as we have you captive, I wonder if I could ask the teachers, do you also teach design, either here or other schools? And if not, why are you teaching history theory?
I think, for me at least, completely honestly, it was sort of the first opportunity that I was given straight out of the MA. And I had expressed my interest in teaching from the get-go, starting the MA, and was just really lucky to get the opportunity to at least start somewhere. And I think in most architecture schools, it's actually quite hard to get a unit. So, I mean, I think...
Can I interject that and follow up with Mollie? Because I think it's a very important question, and I may actually make a lot of political blunders right now, but I do teach design, and I have taught design in a number of schools. And being trained as an architect and practiced as an architect, I made a conscious decision to go back to a theory program and obtain another degree and come back and naively attempt to teach both. I think it is an important question, because as much as we can talk about the ambition of kind of recurating the project of history and theory within AA, and I think a lot of US schools just have a different political structure, but I think they've also faced the same questions at certain points. And one of the schools I can name is, for example, UCLA, who have opened up a lot of these kind of thorny questions of the relationship between what is happening in the research fields and the design fields of architecture. I think it, whether actively at a current point a number of young tutors teach design or not, I think it is important to note that they do come from a particular viewpoint that views design and research is inherently linked, and I think in many levels of the discussions that we've had is not particularly to teach students to be poor scholars, or to teach scholars to be weekend designers, but to actually try to install in them a sense that they don't need to necessarily catch up to sound knowledgeable in a jury, and they don't necessarily need to write kind of a historical research paper and abandon its links to design. Is actually to learn to the techniques that would make that project far more ambitious long term, with the ability to excavate and then bring that back. There's been several things said today about how do then we go back? How do when we reset the precedent, how do we utilize it? And part of the knowledge is that some of the most interesting figures in the fields of architecture have engaged in both activities throughout their careers. May not at the same time, but throughout their lives. And a lot of young students who are used to understanding research as something as browsing the web are missing a fundamental condition of architectural construction. So I think from our point of view as educators, this is probably both a weakness and a strength that we try to support, which is we try to operate on both sides. Because I think your question, for me, sets up, and I think the students should hopefully answer.
Hey, that's my mic.
I'll take that. Thank you. There's one missing.
I think it's a very interesting question that Charles asked, because, I mean, the main I don't teach in a design studio at all, so I just teach in Histories and Theories courses, mainly because nobody knows what they mean, and that just fascinates me.
I didn't hear you. Maybe the question
Nobody knows what history or theory really means, and nobody really knows.
Nobody in your class.
That's my.
I am one of those nobody.
Okay.
What makes you think that? That's an odd thing to say.
I think it's odd because people use the terms history and theory, and people use a lot of terms that are large historical and theoretical categories many times, and they seem to use them in several, if not dozens, of different ways without knowing the difference between them. I mean, theory is usually taken to be something that is like a manifesto for design in a lot of cases.
History and theories.
Excuse me?
Why is history singular and theories plural?
In Teferi's book.
And these days, I notice you have here history's plural and theories plural.
This was something that I was literally just going to bring up, is that one of the first discussions that I had with Marina when I started the MA was why it was titled Histories and Theories, and why the undergraduate school was titled History and Theory.
It should be called Theory and Histories. Because, I mean, well, I won't say because, but I mean, but I don't think because you're confused doesn't mean we're confused.
I mean, that's fair enough. I guess part of.
But what we're talking about, and I'll call Braden, is a kind of institutional confusion in a sense, and he's surely right. That we, if that's the right term for speaking of and within the institution, we don't know in that sense what we're doing. I think the last time that architecture schools knew what theory was probably when they were interested in deconstruction, because they knew that they didn't know what it meant. So they were always quite nice to people like me who come along and say, well, this is really is. And so, you know, knowing what you don't know actually stabilized the situation for a while. Now, as it were, these are hard times for a kind of theorist, because how can I put it? You know, at one point, the whole library seemed to be full of books on or by Derrida. And then, God damn it, you know, the next year, because they're very smart up there, changing all the books around. And it's partly, you know, every book is about what kind of fish do. You know, you couldn't see a picture on the outside of it. It's like a group of fish turning left. And you think, why is that? You know, I quite like the Derrida stuff myself, but, you know, I mean, the fucking fish. So we had complexity theory. And
Derrida leads directly to the fish.
Oh no, yeah, sure.
Well,
You'll have to tell us about that next time.
The point, the point being, I think at that point, units thought they did theory as well.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in a curious way, one day you're teaching Derrida, the next day you've got nothing to do, so you go back to teaching Vitruvius. And it was kind of quite odd like that. And now, you know, all architects think they're theorists. I mean, they're wrong, but I mean, how would they know, poor dears?
I think part of it is, at least for me, is sort of the, I don't think a lot of the times the students really understand the role of history and theory as sort of a program in the school. And maybe this is what you were getting at a little bit, Braden, is that they don't know what it, I mean, hey, don't let me like speak for you, but like on a general level, like the interest or the engagement with it is sort of mystifying to me, coming from a background where I'm, you know, quote unquote trained as.
But sorry, Ellen.
In the field.
Well, like I said before, I feel that history and theory is really a microcosm for architecture in general. And in fact, it's a failure. People don't know why they're studying architecture because they don't know what architecture is. You can't even really begin to talk. Too big?
I want just to underline and make other people like respond to you.
Yeah.
Because this is the first time, it seems to me, in the conference, people have been, you know, as the conference had advertised, it's about the relationship between history teaching and the rest of the school, in which there are certain problems about history and, you know, it's too much time taken up with design or something. Now you're raising the fact that actually, in a sense, the malaise of the history and theory actually it's merely a symptom of a general malaise.
But I think you've brought up the underlying reason for this, which is perhaps architecture has failed to indicate its region that it wishes to monopolize. I mean, that for me, you know, that for me would be the reason.
Well, how about architecture fails to live up to its fantasies of a region that it wishes to monopolize, and at the same time fails at recognizing the reasons in which in the areas, regions in which it succeeds and is effective?
Yeah, I think it's been over-optimistic and is in self-denial.
An amazing conclusion.
Thank you.
I mean, memorable. I mean, you'll not be able to forget that in a long time. I'm told that we have 5 minutes before the school closes. I apologize. Sorry, it's nothing to do with it, but I'm sorry. I think this discussion could have gone on productively for kind of longer. I apologize. I didn't quite realize the time. I should say that in some ways, the conversation, this conference or versions of it are going to continue in the summer. We're going to have one session in, we've arranged in Stockholm and one in Oslo. Can I just briefly introduce Tutor Serenius, who's professor at Oslo?
No, so it will be a continuation in the form of a bigger symposium, 2-day symposium in Stockholm on the Architecture Museum, and then following on that, and that will be the 6th and 7th of September. And following on from that, it will be a kind of smaller discussion in Oslo, and it's part of touring this event, and probably throwing it back into the AA.
So anyone who wants further details, the best thing is to send me an email and then go and phone up someone else. No, I will reply. I would like to thank this panel, and I'm sorry we haven't had time to go further. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to these 2 days, and